Anybody who has mixed sourdough starter at one time or another has wondered about feeding ratios. How much flour to include? How much water to include? What does 1-1-1 mean? Or 1-2-2? Or 1-4-4, etc. And anybody who has mixed flour, water, salt, and starter has wondered what is the correct amount of flour, or how much water to include? What is hydration percentage, and how is it calculated? If this sounds familiar, then this video is for you. Sourdough starter feeding ratios are always listed with the amount of starter first. As an example pictured here is a 1-to-1-to-1 feeding ratio, which simply means however amount of starter and equal amount of flour and water are added. Since we are beginning with 60 grams of starter, 60 grams of flour and 60 grams of water are added. In a 1-to-4-to-4 feeding ratio, since we begin with 40 grams of starter, 4 times that amount, or 160 grams of flour and 160 grams of water, are added. Yesterday I was experimenting making sourdough waffles, and here I have some leftover starter I need to use up. My 2-loaf sourdough bread recipe calls for 200 grams of sourdough starter, so I'm going to mix 50 grams of starter with 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water. I just demonstrated a 1-to-2-to-2 sourdough feeding ratio. The vast majority of time, the same amount of flour and the same amount of water are added. This is called 100% hydration, but more about hydration later in this video. As an experiment, I'm going to demonstrate a feeding of 50 grams of starter, 100 grams of flour, and 140 grams of water. I just demonstrated a feeding ratio of 1 to 2 to 2.8, specifically 50 grams of starter, 100 grams of flour, and 140 grams of water. I would never actually use this ratio, but did so as an experiment. After allowing the 1 to 2 to 2.8 and the 1 to 2 to 2 to rise for about 5 hours, here are the results. At first glance, they looked like they rose about the same, but that's not what happened. Remember, the jar on the left had 40 more grams of water, and the level of starter immediately after mixing was measured by the top of the horizontal blue tape. So, the starter on the left with the 1 to 2 to 2.8 ratio appears to have risen slightly less than double, and the jar on the right with the feeding ratio of 1 to 2 to 2 appears to have nearly tripled in volume. So, in summary, sourdough starter feeding ratio is the relation of first starter followed by flour and water, and I highly encourage you to add by weight the same amount of flour as water. As important as the understanding of sourdough feeding ratio is, to consistently produce beautiful and delicious sourdough bread, it may be even more critical to understand hydration in the dough. Here is a batch of dough where I've just mixed flour, salt, starter, and water. Hydration is the total amount of water in the dough measured by a percent of the total flour in the dough. Let me explain. In baker's percentage, flour is always 100% and everything else is a percent of flour. As an example, if you have a recipe that calls for 600 grams of flour and 300 grams of water, that would be 50% hydration, meaning 300 grams of water is 50% as much as 600 grams of flour. Here is my 2-loaf sourdough bread recipe, which calls for 900 grams of bread flour, 600 grams of water, 200 grams of starter, 20 grams of salt, which is 70% hydration. Let's go through the math. 900 grams of bread flour plus 100 grams of flour from the starter equals 1,000 grams total flour in the dough. 600 grams of water plus 100 grams of water from the starter equals 700 grams total water in the dough. My 2-loaf sourdough bread recipe has a total of 700 grams of water in the dough and a total of 1,000 grams of flour in the dough. 700 is 70% of 1,000. My sourdough has 70% hydration. Always remember to include the water and flour in your sourdough starter in your total water and total flour calculation. Thanks for watching this video. Please take a moment to click like, subscribe, and leave a comment below, and make it a great day.